Thank you, Frau Dr. Berger, very much for your introduction, and also many thanks to Professor Schoenecker for inviting me to give a talk here. And I will go straight to my topic here this evening. Is the difficulty of deriving autonomy. Actually, I slightly changed my title from the pure practical reason from practical reason to autonomy, and I think it's not it won't matter. They are actually two identical concepts, and so the topic will be slightly changed to the difficulty of deriving autonomy from the pure self-activity on Kant's solution of the circularity between freedom and morality. And as Dr. Berger has already talked a little bit about my abstract, and I will go very fast again through my short introduction of my topic tonight. And in the third chapter of the Groundwork, Kant refers to a subsection of a circular argument concerning freedom and morality. And Kant attempts to resolve this circularity by deriving the concept of autonomy from a pure self-activity in the third subsection of this chapter. However, many Kant scholars have pointed out that there are several argumentative problems regarding this attempt. In response to these criticisms, Heiko Puls argues that Kant could overcome the subsection of the circularity through intuitionistic reading of the moral interest. And as you can see, this text is in some ways a response to Puls, and I think he did really developed very interesting readings of Kant. So it is very a great pity that he cannot no longer continue his research. And after a critical analysis of these views, I argue that we do not need such a radical reading to be able to provide a coherent interpretation of the third chapter of the Groundwork. And I demonstrate that Kant still provides a suitable solution for the circularity problem by considering his deduction of the idea of freedom in the fifth subsection as a part of his systematic argument for the relationship between freedom and morality. And here I will introduce some backgrounds of my research, and especially in the third chapter, I suppose that our audience has already know something about the circularity problems, and this is actually a problem which Kant raised in the third part of the third chapter of the Groundwork, and where Kant mentions several times that there is possibly a kind of circle in his justification for the freedom and the moral law. And here is the quotation: we take ourselves to be free, and so on. And actually, according to some reconstructions, this circle can be represented as follows, in a more simple way, that we are free because we are subject to the law, and we are subject to the law because we are free. For a detailed summary of this, the history of this, the research of the circularity, you can see the for Berger's famous Artikel, der Artikel in dritten Schnitt der Grundlegung einer neuen Interpretation, eine Literaturbericht. Ich finde das eine sehr materialreiche und sehr ganz tolle Aufsatz. Und come back to my topic here, if such a secular reasoning really exists and Kant cannot deal with it, then his justification for the moral law could be questionable. For we must see ourselves as free beings in order to obey the moral law, but we see ourselves as free beings just because the moral law demands it. And this doubtful argument is extremely important for Kant's argument in Groundwork 3. If Kant now wants to justify the validity of the moral law, he only has to provide a convincing argument for the concept of freedom to show that we are indeed free beings. An important point is that his argument must be independent of the presupposition of the moral law. Only in this case could Kant conclusively prove that we should submit to the obligation of the moral law by showing that we are in fact free beings. In deriving the concept of morality, Kant needs to start with a concept of freedom that is independent of the moral presuppositions. I would call such a concept the so-called morally neutral concept of freedom. Although Kant himself does not use this kind of terminology in his text, but we can still recognize this tendency in his resolution of the subsection of the circularity in section 3, which we can see in this quotation. And especially here, Kant mentions the pure self-activity. As I mentioned, although Kant does not explicitly state that his argument would begin with a neutral concept without moral presuppositions, it is clear that he tries to avoid any kind of moralistic description while introducing the concept of pure self-activity. In fact, in distinguishing the difference between the understanding and the reason, the Vernunft und Verstand, in their spontaneity, Kant emphasizes only the difference between them in their speculative use. And from this, he draws a general conclusion that the pure spontaneity of reason is completely independent of the sensibility. And based on this general conclusion, Kant proposed a division between the world of understanding and the world of sense, through which this pure spontaneity is eventually directed to a practical notion of the freedom of will, which is in the first quotation of this slide on this page. And Kant continues his argument by referring to a definition of the positive concept of freedom, which is autonomy, that he gives in the section 1. You can see this from the second quotation here. And this is basically a repeat of his so-called, in between Kant scholars, the Identitätsthese or the Analytisithese in the very beginning of the Groundwork 3. That is in the first subsection of Groundwork 3. And finally, Kant announces at the end of section 3 that subsection 3, I will call all these subsections in Groundwork as section 3, section 1 to 5. Yeah. So at the end of section 3, that Kant avoided the previously mentioned subsection of the circular reasoning. And you can see this from the third quotation here. And in this quotation, Kant states that as soon as we conceive ourselves as free, we place ourselves in the world of understanding and thus cognize erkennen, so sagt Kant, autonomy and morality. Kant is now able to show that we can recognize moral autonomy from the concept of freedom in the sense of pure spontaneity. This means that morality can be derived from the morally neutral concept of pure spontaneity without presupposing any idea of morality. Kant believes that he can now solve the subsection of circularity between freedom and morality, since he proved that we can derive freedom and morality from the consciousness of the pure spontaneity. But is this argument really as successful as Kant himself claims? Actually not. Baranovsky, for example, claims that Kant's resolution is ultimately unsuccessful and that he cannot provide a non-circular justification of moral obligation in Groundwork 3. Baranovsky notes that Kant's resolution of the circular reasoning in Groundwork 452 still presupposed a practical reason. Otherwise, Kant could not be able to derive a practical freedom from the general spontaneity of reason, because, quotation from Baranovsky, reason is not originally practical in all their exquisitions. End of quotation. And Baranovsky perceptively remarks on the problem of Kant's derivation of moral freedom from the pure speculative spontaneity, and even sharper, this criticism can be found in Paul Gaia's interpretation, when Kant says, now, the quotation from Kant, when Kant says, now a human being is actually does find in himself a capacity, and that is reason, end of quotation. It means, according to Gaia, that Kant is trying to prove that, quotation of Gaia, in fact, we do have a way of knowing something about our real natures, about ourselves as we are in ourselves. End of quotation. And Gaia considered this argument, Kant's argument, to be deeply flawed if if the consciousness of pure spontaneity implies an epistemic cognition of our nominal self, then this cognition is either empirical or a priori. And Gaia shows that the former, the empirical cognition, is unjustifiable because here, the quotation here, the fact that we are rational in an empirical sense cannot justify the claim that we are really rational beings in ourselves. And while the later, I mean, the a priori cognition exceeds the limits of the knowledge set by Kant, that is, we cannot know the nominal in a positive sense. So in both sense, it is unjustifiable for Kant. According to these criticisms by Bernovsky and Gaia, Kant could hardly derive freedom and morality from the concept of spontaneity that does not contain any presupposition of practical reason, that is, morality. On the one hand, practical reason cannot be derived directly from the spontaneity which is manifest in the general speculative use of reason, and therefore Kant does not really avoid a circular argument. And it is clear from Bernovsky's criticism that practical reason of action must be presupposed in order to complete Kant's deduction. And on the other hand, it is clear from Gaia's critique that if Kant insists on arguing from the speculative use of reason, it would lead to a self-contradictory result. At least Kant is not capable of directly providing speculative knowledge about our nominal self as freedom. This would impose a huge metaphysical burden on Kant's argument, which Kant could not bear within the framework of the so-called transcendental idealism. Now, if Kant is unable to provide a morally neutral argument for the concept of freedom, would it lead to the frustrating conclusion that the circular argument between freedom and morality is unsolvable in the first place? Or more optimistically, perhaps we can imagine another possibility, that is, even Kant cannot provide a morally neutral argument for freedom, he might be able to resolve his argumentative problem. He still might be able to resolve these argumentative problems in the Groundwork 3. And we can find this kind of alternative interpretation, this kind of possibility in Heiko Puls' interpretation. Like Puls points out that the question, warum aber soll ich mich denn diesem Prinzip unterwerfen, which Kant raises at the beginning of the section 2, is a question about the validity, that is, Geltung, of morality under human conditions. Puls argues that while Kant succeeds in deriving the morality from the concept of freedom in section 1, he does not provide a justification for the reality and indeed the validity of the moral law. In contrast to Gaia, Puls maintains that the validity of the categorical imperative is terminologically not related to the possible question of its metaethical justifiability, but explicitly related to the concept of the acknowledgement that is only a canon. And in Puls' reading, the suspension of the circle a circle does not correspond to the logical circularity, but to a difficulty with respect to the justification of the validity of the categorical imperative. Thus, when Kant declares at the end of section 3 that he solved this circular suspension, this in turn proves that he has also provided a justification for the validity of the categorical imperative. Even if Kant does not literally avoid the logical circular argument in deducing practical reason from the pure spontaneity, his task of deduction can still be considered as successful insofar as the circular argument is resolved in the justification of the validity of the moral law. Therefore, according to Gaia's reading, Puls' reading, Kant no longer needs the morally neutral concept of pure spontaneity. Puls points out that the pure self-activity, die reine Selbsttätigkeit of reason, in the argument in 452 is not only spontaneity in the speculative sense. It could be has some practical or moral implications. And Puls provide here a very insightful argument for the thesis by introducing the regulative function of reason and its relation to ideas, especially noteworthy his interpretation of the B574 in the first critique and its relation to Groundwork 452. And I won't go into the details of his argument here due to the time constraints. And the point of Puls is that he uses Kant's term pure perceptions as a clue to illustrate Kant's theory of practical apperception from his manuscript. And through this, his explanations, Puls is able to show that the practical reason is thus also a perceptive faculty, and the perception of the rational being that is active is the freedom for Kant. And with this argument, it's now possible to deal with Gaia's question that we are unable to cognize our ontological self as free, according to Puls' reading. The spontaneity of reason that makes us a member of the world of understanding is not a theoretical knowledge of our ontological self. Our consciousness of freedom is based on a practical activity of reason, and praktische Vernunftversuch. In that case, Kant's argument in 452 is not a metaphysical and ontological argument, but only a practical argument, and would not contradict Kant's view of the unknowability of the ontological self. And after solving these troublesome problems that Gaia has pointed out, Puls developed his argument further to derive the validity of the moral law. And since Kant, in his discussion of the subsection of circle in 450, refers to the interest in morality as a consequence of the presupposition of the importance of moral laws, Puls argues that the key concept in resolving this problem is the moral interest. And Kant concludes this paragraph with a series of problems, like how is this possible, consequently from where the moral law connects, we cannot yet see in such a way. Also the famous phrase that Kant auf Deutsch, woher das moralische Gesetz verbinde, können wir auf solche Art noch nicht einsehen. And Puls argues that these questions points to the difficulty that warum wir auf diese from in such way cannot see in such way. The problems or the difficulties lies in that even assuming the importance of the moral law or our interest in moral law, we still cannot answer the question as to why we should submit to the moral law, since the mere presupposition of an interest in the moral law cannot solve the question of the moral validity. Like Kant has to explain why we have this kind of interest or how this interest functions. And Puls argued that the solution to this question must lie in interpretation of the function of the interest. Thus, if we would, the quotation of Puls, if we could have the concept of such an interest, one could actually answer the question of the validity of the moral law and prove it for itself. The resolution of the circular subsection takes place by pointing out that man really finds in himself the faculty of practical reason, and thus also the moral interest. End of quotation. And moreover, Puls connects this moral interest with the sense of respect. Yeah, in the process of the third, fourth, and fifth sections, after the recourse of the faculty legitimating freedom, which man really finds in himself, wherever Kant speaks kind of a cognition, the erkennen, or a consciousness or of the moral law, then the cognition or the consciousness is one attended through the feeling of respect. That was the argument of the Puls. And in sum, Puls argues that Kant proves the validity of the moral law in section 3 by equating our interest in the moral law with the feeling of respect and the consciousness of the law. And this is very much the same strategy Kant used in the Faktumslehre in the second critique. And the solution proposed by Puls is to abandon the attempt to prove the morally neutral spontaneity, namely to abandon the so-called circular argument. In this case, Kant's argument is not required to rest on a morally neutral proof of pure spontaneity. For Puls, the faculty that we really find in ourselves is not just a pure spontaneity or a speculative spontaneity, but immediately a practical reason. After all, the argument for the causality of freedom based on the regulative use of reason is only an explanation or an erläuterung that cannot be used as evidence for the reality of the freedom as one of the factors. In other words, what Kant demonstrates here is only the kind of possibility of determining ourselves, for determining our actions on the basis of the regulative function of the freedom. And Puls sidesteps these kind of logical problems of the circular reasoning and deals directly with the validity of the moral law. And such a reading would, on the one hand, avoid the metaphysical and ontological burden Kant might have in reading with the circular reasoning. On the other hand, the general task in Groundwork 3, which is to deduce the validity of the moral law, can be accomplished by Puls' restrictions. And actually, I will agree with Puls' general answer in the first half to the argument, but his further conclusion, which regarded to the interest and the feeling of respect, is a little bit too radical for me. If we refer to Kant's context, especially to some formulations in section 5, we will find that Kant's point is that the obligation of the moral law cannot be explained by an interest at all. Here's the quotation here. It is not, especially the phrase that this is not because the law interests us that it has validity for us. And also in footnote in 459, Kant expressed that the rational interest of the moral law is not the cause of the moral obligation, but the consequence of it. And this means that the ground of the obligation lies in the reason, and since the reason is practical, we can determine sensibility according to the principles of reason, and the result of this determination is the aforementioned interest. This quotation of Kant is in section 5 and can be seen as a certain summary of his deduction of the categorical imperative. Thus, we can see that Kant actually refrains from proving the validity of categorical imperative through an investigation of so-called cognitive function of interest in his deduction. Although Kant refers to the concept of interest in section 3 and even places it in the title, it is nevertheless difficult to understand this interest as an intuitive moral consciousness that can directly resolve the problem of moral obligation. And moreover, Puls' intuitionistic reading of the interest and respect is controversial among Kant scholars. Above all, it remains a controversial thesis whether the feeling of respect has a moral cognitive function in Kant, as we know from the famous debate between Professor Schoenecker and Bojanowski. And even Professor Schoenecker will say that Professor Schoenecker is supporting the cognitive reading of respect, but he mentioned that this reading applies only to the second critique and not to the groundwork. All in all, this is rather controversial reasoning by Puls. It's maybe not the closest interpretation for Kant at the very last. This interpretation is based on a large part of Puls' own reconstruction of Kant's text. But still, we can get some progress from the interpretation of Puls. First, even if Kant does not provide a logically non-circular argument for the ontological connection between freedom and morality, it does not mean that Kant's work in Groundwork 3 has failed. This is because the very purpose of his solution of the circular reasoning is to explain the ground of the moral obligation. And however, An intuitionistic argument of the moral consciousness with cognitive function as founded in Puls does not fit into the proof structure of the Groundwork 3. Thus, my next task is to find a possible solution of the subsection of the circularity that is guided by these two principles. In other words, we can accept some of the insight of Puls' reading, but we need not to develop such a radical moral intuitionism. And now, it's concerning the structure of the arguments in Groundwork 3. The first problem that I have to deal with concerns Puls' so-called strong moral intuitionism. In other words, what is Puls' motivation for insisting such a radical reading? The answer can be traced back to his understanding of the structure of the argument in Groundwork 3. Puls' interpretation of Groundwork 3 could be characterized as a revolutionary. In general, Puls argues that Kant uses the same strategy of the theory of fact or reason to justify the categorical imperative in Groundwork 3, and just as he did in this second critique, in order to achieve this ambitious goal, which does not clearly fit Kant's actual argument, Puls has to roughly reconstruct Kant's original argumentative structure. Puls must insist on this rather ambitious reading if he wants to show that in section 3, Kant already proves the validity of the moral law by resolving the problem of circularity. And the question is now whether Kant's solution to that problem really requires these kind of reconstructions, or does the resolution of the circularity argument in section 3 directly entail a complete justification of the validity of the moral law? And my answer is absolutely not. In section 1, Kant formulates the thesis of the so-called analyzability, that the morality becomes knowable by merely dissecting of the concept of freedom of the will in 447. Thus, if the circular argument between the morality and freedom is to be resolved, and if Kant does not want to overturn this kind of analyzability, then he has to show that we do not have to propose the concept of morality in order to derive the concept of freedom. This is the so-called morally neutral concept of freedom, since the inference from the freedom to morality is already established in the first section of the Groundwork 3. And he can transfer this kind of circular reason between the freedom and morality into a one-way logical chain, like you can see here, from the spontaneity to freedom and to morality. And so Kant's task should be to demonstrate that the concept of freedom can be deduced from something that is not morally relevant, like a kind of more pure spontaneity. At least Kant tries to do this, and we just demonstrated that this is actually impossible. But as mentioned earlier, the main problem with this argument is that Kant is unable to explain freedom independently of the morality. There is no way for him to justify our freedom in an ontological sense independently of practical reason. And that is why he writes at the beginning of the section 3 here. Yeah, we could not, however, prove it as something actual even in ourselves or in human natures. And many scholars, including Puls and Gaia, have interpreted this passage as Kant's attempt to prove the validity of the moral law by demonstrating the reality of freedom. However, if we consider the context more closely, we can see that this passage does not refer to the general question of the validity of the moral law, but specifically to the fact that Kant is unable to prove the reality of freedom independently of the resource to the concept of morality in the secular argument between the concept of morality and freedom. And we can see this from the second quotation here. And this passage stands in the context of Kant's discussion of the relation between freedom and morality. And it does not aim at explaining the validity of morality in general. And thus phrases such as the reality and objective necessity of freedom, or kind of why should I submit to this principle, does not indicate that Kant seems to be concerned with the question of the validity of the moral law in the sense of Puls and Gaius. And Kant's task in section 3 is not, or at least not directly, to prove the validity of the moral law. On the contrary, although in 449 Kant does mention the validity and the practical necessity of the submission of the moral law, he admits that there is unfortunately no sufficient answer for it. And Kant believes that he cannot resolve this circular argument by proving the reality of freedom. However, he still has one way out, namely accounting for our consciousness of freedom by clarifying the distinction between the sensible world and the world of understanding. And we can see this. I will skip the concrete argument of Kant of this. We can see this from Kant's quotation of the at the very beginning of this presentation, and many scholars, including and I mean, it is particularly noteworthy that Kant clearly used the thesis of the identity or the analyzability between the freedom and morality here in the 452 and 453 as a given premise in his argument that you can see in the first quotation here. And Kant concludes his argument in section 3 without providing any further argument for these theses that which he raised in the first section. However, the problem is that when Kant states the analyzability thesis in section 1, he does not provide sufficient evidence for this presupposition either. Many of the criticisms of Kant's argument in Groundwork 3 are based on the critique of this incomplete justification for the definition of freedom in the section 1. Like Allison argues that the problem with Kant's argument is that he provides no further explanation for why the positive concept of freedom must be governed by a necessary law. And the similar criticism can be seen in Amerikson and Gaia and so on. And in other words, in his solution to the apparently circular argument, Kant includes a definition that is not fully justified, namely a positive concept of freedom that is consistent with the moral law. This leads to one of the most crucial problems of his argument, namely that Kant equals a pure spontaneity directly with morally lawful freedom without explaining this definition sufficiently in the first section or in the third section. Although Kant's argument seems to start from the pure self-activity, a moral implication is already contained in this self-activity. So this is the very problem that leads to Kant's inability to provide a completely non-circular argument. And despite this problem and the fact that Kant cannot provide a completely non-circular argument, we cannot come to Proust's conclusion that Kant's argument is directly premised on a moral consciousness. Roughly speaking, Kant's argument can be divided into two parts as my reading. First, Kant argues for our consciousness of the reason and freedom, and then for a consciousness of moral laws through the analytical connection between the freedom and morality. In other words, although a moral implication is already contained in the consciousness of spontaneity, Kant still treats them as two distinct theses. That these two theses are separated can be seen from the following quotation. Separated them into different colors. And in this way, Kant avoids a circular argument between the freedom and the morality by showing that the concept of freedom can be deduced from the seemingly morally irrelevant concept that is the pure self-activities. That is only a seemingly morally irrelevant, but actually not. Yeah. It is particularly important to note that in this argument that Kant's argument in section 3 concerns only our consciousness of a pure and indeed morally neutral transcendental freedom, based on the mere spontaneity of reason. In other words, what is relevant here is only the transcendental possibility of the causality of freedom. But in the second step of the argument concerning our consciousness of the moral law, Kant does not provide a new argument with respect to section 1 and 2, but simply follows the previous definition, just a definition of the analyzability of freedom and morality. And this is the crucial hint for understanding the argumentative structure of Groundwork 3, for the specific concept of freedom involving moral implications that Kant proposed in the section 1 is not yet justified in detail, but is given as an a priori philosophical definition. And if Kant then provides no further argument for this definition in section 3, then the deduction of the categorical imperative is still not fully completed. So Kant faced a similar problem as he did in section 1, namely that he cannot provide a further justification for the identity of the freedom and morality. As a result, in the section 3, Kant cannot explain the reason why we have to think the pure spontaneity as the law for morality. And an answer to this question is found in section 5 rather than in section 3. In section 5, Kant takes a further deduction of the idea of freedom. Here, like on the one hand, he shows that the freedom is only the idea of reason, like the objectivity reality of which is in itself doubtful. Thus, we can never understand how freedom is possible. On the other hand, Kant provides proves that there is no real contradiction between freedom and natural necessity, although he still does not give a direct answer to the previously left questions, such as how freedom is necessarily a causality of lawfulness. Kant at least provide here a possible justification or deduction of our practical use of the idea of freedom. Since there is no contradiction between the idea of freedom and the concept of nature, we can legitimately use this regulative idea of reason in the practical philosophy. And finally, Kant comes to the following conclusion in section 5. And because of the limitation of the human reason and the external boundaries of practical philosophy, Kant is unable to provide a completely non-circular argument for the positive concept of freedom. But Kant does provide a transcendental solution to the subsection of the circularity. That is the distinguishing between two words and the transcendental deduction of the regulative use of the idea of freedom. While this is a relatively weak argument compared to Puls' reconstruction, it's nevertheless the most adequate justification that can be offered within the framework of the transcendental idealism. And the incompleteness of Kant's argument in section 3 is not too much of the problem for our reasoning or for my reading, because Kant will still deal with the issues in this issue in section 5. But it is a serious problem of Puls' interpretation. Puls, like, he has to break Kant's original argumentative structure to show that Kant is already done with the deduction of the moral law in section 3. His solution is to argue directly for an intuitive consciousness of the moral law, or positive freedom. Puls must argue that our consciousness of reason is not a consciousness of a neutral spontaneity, but a moral consciousness, and indeed a moral motivational consciousness. And this reading of Puls is, it's a brilliant argument in a general sense. If Puls can show that we do indeed have this kind of immediate consciousness of the moral law, he has nevertheless proved the reality of both moral law and positive freedom, and thus also provides a validity of the categorical imperative. And this is perhaps even better, or at least more powerful than Kant's original argument in countering the moral nihilism. For Puls is able to explain the reason of our moral action by the factual and the motivational consciousness. and to trace the normativity of the moral action back to a real feeling or interest or respect, indeed, instead of some unprovable metaphysical presuppositions. But Kant's opponent in Groundwork 3 may not be the moral nihilism, for Kant does not bother to deal with the skeptics who, while acknowledging the obligation of the moral law, nevertheless does not to submit to it, as we can see in his examples dealing with the Bösewicht. And Kant's task of the Groundwork 3 is none other than to establish an obligation of the moral law and its origin in order to justify the possibility of the categorical imperative evidence. The evidence for this is Kant's clear emphasis that freedom is only an idea of reason, the objective reality of which is in itself doubtful. With this statement, it is clear that Kant's argument in 452 does not go significantly beyond the explanation he provided in the first critique. For the possibility of the causality of freedom on the basis of regulative function of reason, that is to say, in the section 3, Kant merely provides an argument for the transcendental condition of the categorical imperative through the regulative use function of reason by showing that we can call ourselves rational beings, and then we can act autonomously and indeed morally by virtue of reason's self-activity. But there remains some still unresolved question in section 3, which has to be dealt in the fifth section. And here I will come to my conclusion that in Kant's solution of the subsection of circularity concerning the freedom and morality, he attempts to demonstrate the derivation of the pure self-activity to practical reason. Because of the limitations of transcendental idealism, it is indeed difficult to expect Kant to provide such a morally presuppositionless argument for the reality of freedom. However, this does not mean that his resolution to the threat of circularity is a failure or deeply flawed. If not Kant's argument in section 3 are considered, Kant's argument is insufficient. If only Kant's argument in section 3 are considered, Kant's argument is, of course, insufficient, since Kant cannot provide whether consciousness of pure spontaneity actually exists in us. But we can consider the resolution of the circular argument more sympathetically, if we do not expect Kant to resolve his problem of the validity of the moral law here by a one-step argument, or if we do not regard Kant's task of deduction as already completed in section 3, we could consider Groundwork as a systematic work. Kant uses the definition of the positive freedom presented in section 1 to solve the circular subsection in section 3. But this definition of the positive freedom is not justified until section 5. In this way, Kant still succeeds in showing the possibility of overcoming this circularity. Like from the consciousness of pure spontaneity arises the distinction between the world of sense and the world of understanding. If we understand ourselves as members of the world of understanding, we are also governed by the causality of freedom, and especially by the causality of moral law. We must admit that this argument has its limitations. Unless Kant can prove that pure spontaneity is necessarily a lawful causality, it still cannot be considered as a logical, non-circular argument. However, Kant's argument at least offered a way to overcome the mutual definition of the freedom and the moral law. Unfortunately, the new definition of the pure self-activity is not yet completely moral neutral in section 3. But Kant has completed the formal distinction between the morality and the freedom So we can expect a further justification in the deduction for the freedom in section 5. In this way, we can show that Kant's solution to the circular subsection in section 3 is not deeply flawed, while not reconstructing Kant's original text.